remember that night pretty clearly. I was 14, and my parents had left me in charge of my little cousin, who was about 6 at the time. It wasn't a big deal. I'd watched him before, and he was a pretty easy kid to look after. We were just hanging out in the living room, watching some cartoons. The house was dead quiet, except for the TV, and it was supposed to be a chill night. But for some reason, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. You know when something just feels off, but you can't put your finger on it? That's what it was like. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid or whatever, but the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it got. It was like my brain was telling me something was wrong, but everything seemed normal. The doors were locked, the lights were on, and we were safe inside, so I figured I was just overthinking things. Still, I couldn't help it. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something, even though I didn't know what. It was just this nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. It was getting later, and my cousin was starting to doze off on the couch. I was still on edge, though. That feeling of something being wrong just wouldn't leave me alone. I got up to check the windows and doors again, more to calm myself down than anything else. When I walked over to the window, something caught my eye. This dark shape just standing there in the yard. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe some shadows from the trees, but then I saw it move. I squinted, trying to make it out, and that's when I realized it wasn't just some shadow. It was a person. My heart skipped a beat. The guy looked messed up. His clothes were all ragged, and his hair was wild, sticking out in every direction. But what really freaked me out was where he was looking. His eyes weren't on me. They were locked on my cousin, who was half asleep on the couch, completely unaware of what was going on. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was maybe he was lost or something, but the way he was staring, it wasn't right. It was like he was studying my cousin, like he was planning something. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some random guy wandering by. He was there for a reason, and I knew it wasn't good. I had to think fast. My cousin was still on the couch, eyes half closed, completely clueless about the creep outside. The last thing I wanted was to scare him, so I had to play it cool. I walked over and nudged him, saying something like, "Hey, let's go upstairs, okay? You can sleep in my room tonight." He just nodded, too sleepy to question it. As we headed upstairs, I kept glancing back at the window, but the guy didn't move. He was still just standing there, staring. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep my voice calm, like everything was normal. When we got to my room, I tucked my cousin into bed, telling him I'd be right back. He was out cold in seconds, which was a relief, but also made me realize how serious this was. I was the only one who could do anything. I went downstairs as quietly as I could and grabbed the first thing that seemed like a weapon, a meat tenderizer from the kitchen drawer. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but it was heavy and had a decent grip. It was better than nothing. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I stood there for a minute, trying to get my nerves under control, but all I could think about was that guy outside and what he might do if he got in. I had no idea what I was up against, or if I could even handle it, but I knew one thing. I had to protect my cousin, no matter what. I stood there in the kitchen, gripping that meat tenderizer so hard my knuckles turned white. The house was completely silent, and I kept telling myself maybe the guy would just leave, that maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. And when I was climbing the stairs back to the room my cousin was in, it happened. A loud crash shattered the silence. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house, and my stomach dropped. He was inside. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind was racing, but it was like my body was stuck in place. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, making their way through the downstairs rooms. He was in the house, and he was looking for us. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, but I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps were getting closer, each one like a countdown to something terrible. I could picture him moving through the house, searching, getting closer to the stairs. I wanted to run, to grab my cousin and get out of there, but I knew there was no time. I was trapped. The only thing between that guy and my cousin was me, and all I had was a meat tenderizer and a whole lot of fear. As the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, I held my breath, knowing that any second now I'd have to face him. I was terrified, more scared than I'd ever been in my life, but I knew I had to be ready. The footsteps were right below me now, slow and heavy, like the guy was taking his time. I could feel the sweat running down my face, and my heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I knew I couldn't hide forever. Any second now, he'd be coming up those stairs, and I'd have to do something. I tried to psych myself up, telling myself I could handle it, but the truth was, I was terrified. I'd never been so scared in my life. And then, just as I heard the first creak of a step under his weight, there was a sudden flash of blue and red lights outside, followed by the sound of sirens. The footsteps stopped. A loud voice shouted something I couldn't make out, and then there was a commotion downstairs. Doors slamming, more shouting, and the sound of a struggle. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, listening. It felt like hours before I finally heard the police coming up the stairs, calling out that it was safe, that the guy was caught. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding and dropped the meat tenderizer to the floor. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely stand. One of the officers found me at the top of the stairs and told me it was over. He explained that a neighbor had heard the glass break and called 911. They got there just in time. The man they arrested was a fugitive, a patient who'd escaped from a nearby psychiatric hospital. Dangerous, they said. Violent. I felt sick. I was this close to facing him alone, and I didn't even want to think about what could have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Even though it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I kept replaying the night in my head, over and over, wondering what might have happened if things had gone differently. I'd been lucky, but that didn't change the fact that I'd come face to face with something truly terrifying. It all started with little things that seemed off. I'd go outside in the morning and notice that garden tools were out of place. My rake was leaning against the wrong wall, and the hose was coiled in a different spot. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was probably animals messing around, or maybe some neighborhood kids playing pranks. But then it kept happening. More stuff kept getting moved around, and it wasn't just random. The chair on the porch was shifted, the pots on the steps were rearranged. It was odd, but nothing that screamed danger, so I shrugged it off and thought it was probably nothing. Still, it started to bug me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few days, I started noticing a weird pattern in how things were being moved. It wasn't just random anymore. The way the garden tools were placed, the way the pots were lined up, it was all too deliberate. It seemed like someone was trying to arrange things in a specific way. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't just some random mess. Someone was coming into my yard and moving stuff around on purpose. I couldn't think of any other explanation. The more I saw these strange arrangements, the more it freaked me out. It wasn't just about stuff being moved. It was about someone being there, messing with things, and maybe even watching me. The idea that someone was intentionally sneaking into my yard and leaving these signs started to really get under my skin. I decided to set up some security cameras around the yard to figure out what was going on. I figured if I could catch whoever was messing with my stuff, it might make things a little clearer. The next morning, I checked the footage. I was not prepared for what I saw. There was this guy, someone I'd never seen before, just standing in my yard. He wasn't moving around, wasn't messing with anything. He was just standing there, staring at my house for hours. It was like he was completely fixated on it. He didn't touch a single thing or even seem to move, just stood there and watched. Then after a while, he just left, disappearing without a trace. Seeing that footage was a real wake-up call. It wasn't just a prank or a random nuisance. This was someone deliberately coming into my yard and watching me. I called the police right away and showed them the footage. They came over, took a look, and checked around the yard. They tried to find any clues or evidence that might lead to identifying the guy, but there was nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing that could help them figure out who he was or what he wanted. The police told me they'd keep an eye out, but they didn't have much to go on. The guy didn't come back after that, but the whole situation left me feeling pretty helpless. Without any leads or new evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I felt frustrated and more on edge than ever, knowing that someone had been watching me and might come back at any time. Every night, I'd lie in bed, jumping at every little sound and constantly checking the cameras. I kept thinking that maybe he'd come back or that there was someone else out there watching me. The whole thing messed with my head. I was always on edge, unable to relax. The lack of closure drove me nuts, knowing that the guy was still out there somewhere, even if I never saw him again. It's like I was trapped in a state of constant paranoia, never really feeling safe in my own home. The fear of not knowing who he was or what he wanted just kept gnawing at me. It was just another evening. I was watching TV, scrolling through my phone, nothing out of the ordinary. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't really think much of it. Then the doorbell rang. It was weird because my parents usually just knock or use their key when they come home, so I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up, figuring it might be a neighbor or something, and went to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. At first, I thought it might have been a prank, but then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was this guy standing near the gate, just sort of lingering there. He looked pretty rough, like he hadn't showered in days. He was wearing a torn green shirt, some old denim shorts, and he didn't even have shoes on. It was definitely not someone I recognized, and the whole situation felt off. I stepped outside to get a closer look at the guy. He didn't move, just stood there by the gate, staring at nothing in particular. His clothes were even worse up close. His shirt was torn in a few places, and the denim shorts looked like they were about to fall apart. And yeah, he was definitely barefoot, which just added to the weirdness. I called out to him, asking, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I tried to sound confident, but honestly, I was starting to feel pretty uneasy. The guy didn't answer right away. He just turned his head slowly to look at me, and then in this really low, creepy whisper, he said, "Just looking at the trees." That was it. That was his whole explanation. I didn't know what to say. It was such a bizarre answer that it threw me off. The way he said it, like it made perfect sense, just made everything feel even more wrong. I could feel my skin start to crawl, but I tried to keep it together, not wanting to let on that I was freaked out. And I kept looking at him, still trying to figure out what this guy's deal was, when suddenly he took a step toward the gate. I froze at the moment. He reached out and grabbed the handle, giving it a little shake, like he was testing if it would open. That's when it hit me. This guy wasn't just some weirdo wandering around. He was trying to see if he could get in. My mind started racing, thinking about what could happen if he actually made it inside. I took a deep breath and shouted, "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Get out of here." I tried to sound as tough as I could, but I was freaking out inside. For a second, he just stared at me like he was sizing me up. It felt like forever, but then he slowly let go of the gate and took a step back. He didn't say anything, just turned around and started walking away down the street. I didn't move until he was completely out of sight. As soon as he was gone, I locked the gate and bolted back inside, double-checking all the locks on the doors and windows. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't believe how close I'd come to something really bad happening. The whole thing left me rattled, like I just dodged a bullet. After the guy finally walked away, I tried to calm down, but it wasn't that easy. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't opened the door or if he had somehow gotten inside. The more I thought about it, the more freaked out I got. What if he came back? What if he wasn't alone? I stayed up for the rest of the night, too on edge to even think about sleeping. Every little sound made me jump. I kept checking the windows, peeking through the blinds to make sure he wasn't lurking around somewhere. Even when the sun started to come up, I still couldn't relax. The whole experience left me feeling vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. My house, which used to feel safe, now felt like it could be invaded at any moment, and that thought just wouldn't leave me alone. I realized how quickly things could have gone bad and how close I came to a real nightmare. Even now, I still get uneasy whenever I hear a knock at the door or see someone hanging around outside. It's like a constant reminder that the world isn't as safe as I thought it was, and that feeling has stuck with me ever since.